We really need to think about the lives that are threatened and destroyed at the hands of a lynch mob, and what that is and what those challenges are for us, because that happens not just on one level, it's multiple levels.
I think with all that's happening today, we become so desensitized that you need a little touch of your humanity in doing this research.
Them leaving these names, especially in the case of the Freedmen's Bureau, murders and outrages and the lynchings and stuff that took place, that was that generation's form of a hashtag.
Wondering what happened to empathy, what happened to people on a legal level, what were the situations that people were working with that enabled this to happen.
Just wanting to get the whole truth out there, not just what may have been in a newspaper clipping where the victim's name was just almost an afterthought, and in many times the victim's name wasn't even given, but to try to find more of the truth and to tell more of that person's story so that their descendants know more than just my ancestor was lynched, but that they know the whole story.
There's people out there that still think we're people with no history.
Any person of color who was arrested, it was like they got sentenced. They got, they had everything from being executed to being imprisoned. I mean, it was ridiculous. And then even though you had the perpetrators mentioned in the murders and outrages, when you get to look at the congressional report, man, there's nothing in there. Those names are all gone. And basically you have people who can't really speak because that record is out there and that can come back to them.
It's one thing to have this thought process at a very high level that your family may have been involved in a traumatic event, but it's another thing to willingly go after that information.
There's just so much to unpack. It's nothing worse when you read a newspaper article from that period and he looked at her wrong and that had him killed.
It's like suppressed histories that can't be, that really need to be aired out, especially at a time like now.
Out of the 4,000 plus documented African-American lynchings, at least 200 of them were women. Between 1880 and 1930, these women were lynched by a lynch mob or by conviction in corrupt courts. In doing research for this project, I stumbled across the name Margaret Lashley. Margaret Lashley was the last Black woman to be lynched in the state of Virginia, and it happened in my hometown of Danville, Virginia. She was born about 1867 in Mecklenburg County, Virginia, according to her death record. And she was 25 years old when she was convicted of a murder that she didn't commit and was lynched. So young, she never got to live out her true purpose. According to reports, her supposed lover, James Lyles, murdered her husband, George Lashley, in the front of their yard. A neighbor testified that she had saw the events unfold, and as a result of her testimony, James Lyles and Margaret Lashley was indicted for murder. This is just one of the articles that describes in detail the lynching of Margaret Lashley. And this was written by someone who the reporter interviewed about this lynching because it just happened to be the last lynching to take place in the state of Virginia.
It was several days before Margaret Lashley and Jim Lyles were arrested on suspicion, and the magistrate who heard the preliminary case was about to dismiss them for lack of evidence, when a colored woman came into the courtroom and told the whole story in a most graphic and sensational way. The two were tried jointly after so long a time their counsel having forgotten a number of postponements and worked in several delays of one of a kind and another.
Up until the lynching, she and James Lyles insisted that she was innocent and that he acted alone. Finally, they were convicted and sentenced to be hanged. The case went to the Supreme Court on appeal, but the lower court was sustained, and it was more than 2 years before the extreme penalty of the law was inflicted. The woman admitted her improper relations with Negro Lyles, but to her last moment on earth, denied that she had entered into a conspiracy to murder her husband and knew not that Lyles intended to shoot him when she called him into the yard, but said she called him out to make friends with him before she entered the house and before Lyles and two other of the men who had left her there alone with Lashley, whom she said she feared. The hanging took place on the bright morning of the 22nd of January, 1892, in a high-planked enclosure to the rear of the Danville jail. The sheriff, P.H. Boiseau, allowed only a limited number of witnesses and preachers within the enclosure. There were extended religious services at the gallows, conducted by 2 colored preachers. Margaret Lashley had a magnificent contralto voice. She knew all the hymns in the books, and it must be certain that she never sang better or sweeter than she did as she stood on the gallows that crisp January morning. Just before the last hymn was sung, Margaret Lashley made her dying statement to the effect I have given above, and then of her own accord, she commenced to sing the hymn, "I will soon be at rest over there." Every man in the enclosure was in tears before the hymn was completed, and through misty eyes, they looked at the calmest person in the enclosure, Margaret Lashley. I mean, I just can't imagine being 25 years old. And I mean, as a young woman, we've all made mistakes. We've all done things that we, aren't proud of. And throughout the time that she was on trial, she never once said that she did not have relations with James Lyles, but she insisted that she was innocent up until she was murdered. This article is dated October 18th, 1924. It was in the Danville Register and Bee. And P.H. Boiseau, who was the sergeant at that time who carried out the lynchings, he had an anniversary. And he was actually talking about the lynchings that he remembered.
The day before this execution, Margaret Lashley sent for the sergeant and told him she had heard that a deputy was to have charge of the hanging. She betrayed fear of pain during the ordeal and asked Mr. Boiseau to attend to the hanging personally. Mr. Boiseau says he comforted her by telling her that she would feel nothing and that he would make no mistakes.
I felt so many emotions as I thought about Margaret Lashley's anxiety as she called the deputy over to help ease her mind about the lynching that was about to take place. She was young, 25 years old, hadn't lived life, terrified out of her mind, thinking that could have been me because it's clearly going on today. Same story, just different tactics. Just think about Breonna Taylor and Sandra Bland and so many others. As I was reading these horrific accounts, I thought about how you can compare these public lynchings to the events happening today, where these public acts of torture are being recorded by regular citizens with their cell phones. It has been heavy researching these documented lynchings. I can imagine the thoughts and terror of the Black community that actually watched these lynchings take place is similar to how we feel now watching the murders of people like George Floyd being played out in the media. Once again, I was shocked at what I was reading, priding myself on knowing so much local history. I had never heard the story of Margaret Lashley, but now that I am aware, I will keep telling her story.
This, how skewed newspapers were, where we didn't want to list the perpetrator. Well, you weren't going to list the perpetrator because that was going to offend the white communities that, quote, loved and supported them.
It's a really powerful lesson in terms of how United States institutions tend to deny the violence that they deploy, and yet, you know, you have fallout from this, and it's still a process that people are still healing from, you know, over the centuries.
I never imagined that one day I would discover a death in my family associated with a murder, but I did. The only thing I knew was that my grandmother and her siblings did not grow up with their parents. And when I reached out to one of the relatives, I was told, "Oh, Bernice, leave it alone. It happened a long time ago." I had no idea what the long time ago was. And so I thought I found whatever that long time ago was, that the man had two families. But that really wasn't the secret. The secret was the murder in 1907. I discovered this. As a genealogist, you dig. 113 years ago, after it occurred in Newberry, South Carolina. The pain that I have observed with family members today is probably the same gut-wrenching pain my family experienced when my great-grandfather was murdered in 1907. My paternal family is from Edgefield County, South Carolina. And I found my 2 times great-grandfather enslaved as a child, along with his parents and siblings, and then connected with the descendant of the slave owner of my family. Well, that research just had me really excited, because I found my family going beyond that 1870 census. But then a year after finding my family, I stumbled on an old newspaper heading: Richard Kemp killed by law-abiding citizen John Livingston.
Richard Kemp, colored, was shot and killed by Mr. John Livingston, a peaceful and law-abiding citizen, on his plantation in Floyd Township, this county, Saturday evening. The shooting was clearly a case of self-defense.
Well, who was this law-abiding citizen? You know, for an entire day, I could not believe what I was reading. I really couldn't. I started bargaining with myself. This can't be my Richard. In fact, I remember calling my cousin and I said, "Is this our Richard?" I couldn't believe it. It was my great-grandfather. This murder to me was very similar to those that have been publicized on television, in the news, all around the country. You know, the scenario is always the same. A Black man or woman is suspected of committing a crime, and within minutes, his or her life is extinguished, it's eliminated, like a burning house on fire that must be put out immediately before it spreads and causes more damage. But the perpetrator is allowed to go on about his life as if nothing ever occurred. You know, life as usual until the next fire. The next Black man or woman is once again perceived, and I want to say this, perceived as a threat to the community and must be extinguished. Lights, camera, action. I mean, just think about it. The cameras are rolling. That's right, the cameras are rolling, and the propaganda has begun to justify the killing. The dead person is the evil villain. The murderer is the hero. But the family is left with questions. Why? Why did they have to kill him? What did he do? The pain is gut-wrenching, screaming, shaking pain. And the family is left with a void that cannot be replaced by any reasonable explanation. My husband is dead. My brother is dead. My son is dead. My daddy is dead. Why? 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 You know, the door closes and the family is sitting with disbelief. They're just sitting there, denial, bargaining, wanting answers. Some want revenge and some forgiveness. And then the silence, the payoff, the verdict, not guilty. And now the family is haunted with a legacy of being one more Black family with a murdered family member. It is so, I mean, you know, if you just look at it, and if you believe the articles that where they're written, it looks like, well, maybe Richard really did do something. It wasn't until I read the coroner's report, though, it says something slightly different. There was an inquisition, and it was on the 30th day of September, 1907. And they invited all of these people to come to listen to individuals testifying, supposedly eyewitnesses. So there was a man named Henry DeHart.
Henry DeHart, sworn, says, on 28 September 1907, in Newberry County, South Carolina, near Mr. John N. Livingston's, saw two Negroes, did not know them, saw Mr. Livingston. Negro snapped a pistol at Mr. Livingston in 6 or 8 feet of the house. Then Mr. Livingston fired twice. Negro fell. This happened in the public road about sundown. Signed, H.A. DeHart.
Then there was another guy. His name was McKittrick. I saw 3 Negroes in a buggy, 2 on the seat and 1 on foot. All were hollering, and after they passed the house, a pistol fired. And then in a short distance, they fired several shots. One in the foot of the buggy did the firing. They couldn't tell, they just knew that there was a flash. Okay, so then there's another guy, and his name was Dick Williams. He said Lee Payne and Rich Kemp were in a buggy coming from Mr. Amick's store. They were coming from a store. Lee Payne was at the foot of the buggy. Me and Rich were on the seat. Lee was doing the shooting. I did not see what happened. So it ended up with Richard Kemp Colored was shot in self-defense by John Livingston of Floyd Township. Mr. Kemp died September 29, 1907. Livingston John of Township shot and killed Richard Colored in self-defense. The bail was set at $1,000. Many men volunteered to be bondsmen for his bail. The court session ended murder, not guilty, self-defense. As soon as I read the report, I said, okay, it's already biased. They've already convicted Richard as being the perpetrator. And this man shot, and I would think he may have shot randomly and killed Richard. So Richard was the one that shot at him. But the coroner's report did not say that. The witness did not say that. But he had to justify something. I would look at this as being a power thing. I mean, by them putting it with the headlines the way they wrote it, he was probably well connected in this town. Have just elevated him, and they've put my ancestor down to the floor, and they've elevated him, that which they're telling me, well, my ancestor is not a law-abiding citizen. He's just another thug out in the street. And he could have been. But did that deserve him to be killed? You know, there were no Black newspapers. So what I have was written by the white press. And the white press did what? It said he was killed by a law-abiding citizen, which meant that my ancestor was the villain. It was my ancestor's fault that he was killed. And this man, as they said in the newspaper article, it was self-defense. So the headline was obvious, and I felt that I would find a scenario similar. I just didn't expect to find one similar to what's happening today. Black lives didn't matter then, and Black lives don't matter today.
You know, with us, we have this lens on history that a lot of people don't have. So it's like when we see these things play out, it just reminds us of the things that we research and the things that we hear about and it's like, you know, wake up.
We're going to do what we always have done, and that is survive.
But we're not ready as a country. We're not ready to own that offense.